Yeah, I know I'm like 3 months late to this shit, but who cares? Let's talk about Prehistoric Planet Ice Age, baby! The third season of Apple TV's landmark prehistory documentary, Prehistoric Planet, has now been released, moving things from the end of the Cretaceous with the dinosaurs to now focusing on the extraordinary megafauna of the Ice Age, cataloging everything from the encroachment of the ice sheets to their eventual withdrawal, and how all the magnificent animals, some familiar and others not so much, deal with these conditions. Since the release of this new season back in November, opinions on it have been quite varied, with some calling it the best of the whole show, while others view it in the complete opposite direction. So you guys are probably wondering what my whole stance on the show is. And my answer is that it's Prehistoric Planet. I can only dislike it so much. Okay, that might be a bit too mean. Prehistoric Planet Ice Age for me is definitely the weakest of the 3 seasons released so far. It's the one that has the most glaring issues by far, and of course, we will be diving into those in due time. But of course, I do think it's fair to give this show its flowers, because there are plenty of flowers to be found. In classic Prehistoric Planet fashion, the technical aspects are firing on all cylinders. Starting off with the CGI, the creatures themselves are arguably the best that they've ever looked. The feather and fur details on many of the animals are stellar, and the physics on them are second to none. If I had any sort of complaint regarding the CGI in this show, it's that I find the way that the animals are animated to be a bit too smooth. Like, real animals have these sort of janky movements. They twitch and jitter and snap into different poses. Whereas here, since all the animals are animated on keyframes, they move around much smoother as a result. It's noticeable when they have sequences with real animals juxtaposed with the CGI animals. The Gigantopithecus segment in episode 4 is a great example of what I'm trying to demonstrate here. You come from these super snappy real gibbons to this real smooth Gigantopithecus, and it sort of tells my brain, yeah, one of these things is not like the others, and it's the 10-foot tall ape. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but it's something that I noticed and felt like I had to bring up. Despite this, I wouldn't say that any of these animals are badly animated. In fact, I'd say they're animated excellently. Everything having such a close real-life basis means that it's easier to reference the movements for something like an elephant or a rhino or a big cat, and it definitely sells that illusion. I ragged on the Gigantopithecus earlier, but it does also have this plus of having a close real-life counterpart to pull from, and the way it moves is exactly like a real gorilla. Okay, maybe not exactly, but you get the idea. At the same time though, this is also the CGI's greatest weakness. Because you have animals that have such a close analog to what we already know, it's easier to point out when something is slightly off with how the creature is animated. I think this is why the animals that largely get away with this criticism are the birds. Psilopterus, moas, and elephant birds all have that sort of janky, jittery look that you'd usually get from silly guys like ratites. And because of this, they end up being the most convincing animals in the show more often than not. This of course is to not discredit the work of anyone who worked on the show. This is just something I felt needed to be brought up, and despite these critiques, the VFX team still did a phenomenal job bringing these iconic Ice Age beasties to life, which is all the more impressive considering that now it's a new team working on this show. Seasons 1 and 2 were animated by MPC, however they unfortunately had to shut down just a few years prior, so all the VFX work had to be moved over to the UK-based Framestore, and if that name sounds familiar, then it should, because they were the ones who did the VFX for the Walking Myth series back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Honestly, it's really cool comparing this show to something like Walking with Beasts and seeing the near 25-year difference between both productions, how the creatures have been updated to reflect more accurate science, and just the overall CGI upgrades. It's also fun to notice little details that are shared between both shows. This sound from the Macrochenia in episode 2 is just the Therizinosaurus sound from Chased by Dinosaurs. Like, dog, you're not fooling anyone. The VFX team isn't the only thing about this new season that's changed. David Attenborough has since left the series, and now Tom Hiddleston, Loki himself, has taken over the role of narrator. I think most people were disappointed after learning of Attenborough's departure from the series, though at the same time, it's understandable. The dude's nearly 100. I think him taking a step back from narrating documentaries is a fair choice. And it's not like Hiddleston was just brought in as a famous celebrity voice. He's done work on a couple other Apple TV animal documentaries, so it's not like he's a stranger to the genre, and for what it's worth, I think Hiddleston does a great job with what he's given. When it comes to British actors who've also narrated paleo documentaries, I don't think he has the same gravitas as someone like Kenneth Branagh, but I do think his voice is simultaneously a nice voice to listen to, and also I still think it brings the weight when it's needed. The opening with the mammoth and the blizzard is a great example of this. I wouldn't mind if for any future seasons of the show they decided to keep Hiddleston around as narrator. I think he works very well. As for the score, Andre Rosman and Caro Talvi once again do a great job as always, bringing bringing some great new motifs to the series. My personal favorite has to be that cello piece that they use for the saber-tooth and scimitar-tooth cats. It's simultaneously very powerful and regal at the same time, perfectly fitting for the Ice Age's top predators. This season also changed some things up by introducing a brand new opening theme for the season. I don't like it as much as the theme for seasons 1 and 2, but I will admit it's grown on me quite a bit. I think this adventurous sound fits the unknown frontiers of the Ice Age a good bit, while also sounding just familiar enough to the first 2 seasons to know that we're still getting the same-ish show out of it. Finally, before we get into the more negative side of this video, I want to talk about each of the episodes, as I sorta want to follow up what I said in my H-Cop for this season. So, no, Prehistoric Planet Ice Age didn't really do the pseudo walking with format that I was expecting it to. The series of course opens and closes with the start and end of the Ice Age, which I think is a great choice, but each episode still largely feels more situational as opposed to following a full-blown narrative a la Walking With. This definitely threw me off the first time I watched the show, having my expectations be completely uprooted and replaced with the standard Prehistoric Planet fare instead, but it also wasn't the only thing that did so. Each episode is now structured completely differently as well, each one having a proper cold open, cold open, Ice Age, it's funny, and an individualized intro that shows off what that episode is going to be about. This I'm totally fine with. Again, we're in new territory. There's nothing wrong with changing up the format of how each episode is structured. We do also have some elements from season 2 returning, such as some of the segments being continued later on in the episode, or the uncovered segments at the very end. Addressing each of them respectively, I once again have no issue with the change in the format. It helps keep the audience more engaged with the show throughout, though I did notice that in episode 1 specifically, it seemed like they just straight up stopped the European cave segment just to jump over to the Megalonyx family, then back to the caves for no reason. It threw me through a loop the first time I saw it, and it still confuses me as to why they would even do that. As for the uncovered segments, while I took issue with these back in season 2, I think they work much better here, as they're much more of a general guide to the Ice Age as opposed to answering basic questions as to what dinosaur behavior and physiology was like. Episode 4's segment about the true scale of Ice Age megafauna was a personal highlight of not just these segments, but of the entire season if I'm being completely honest. It gave me a lot of primeval vibes for those who suffer from elite ball knowledge like myself. It's cool seeing a lot of these animals interacting with real places, like Elasmotherium chomping down at a flower shop to the literally me Gigantopithecus. It's insanely novel and I love it for that. Okay, now let's get into the negative stuff. There's quite a few complaints, but they all kind of stem from the same overarching issue. This season has stupid executive corporate bullshit breathing down the back of its neck, and it greatly affects everything in the show. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's 2 main things specifically, but let's start with the most obvious thing that everyone has complained about: the lack of specific names for animals in favor of a common name. So, brief science lesson for the uninformed. Basically, all animals have 2 different names. You have their scientific name, which has the genus and the species name, and then you have the common name, which is pretty much what everyone calls them by. Prehistoric animals generally don't have these names. That is up until you reach the Ice Age. Mammutus primigenius becomes woolly mammoth, Smilodon ovulator becomes saber-toothed cat, and Megatheria, a family name to be more specific, become giant ground sloths. These aren't the only examples, but you get what I mean. Now, Prehistoric Planet Ice Age has a pretty large roster of animals, many of which are incredibly distinct from each other, despite many also being united under the same general family of animals. So, you'd think it'd be a good idea for this documentary to prioritize using the scientific names as much as possible, at least for the ones that really matter, to make sure that audiences don't get confused as to the many different animals that show up, right? Right.
This is a huge sloth, a family of very sleepy sloths, including this young Ice Age armadillo. An armadillo the size of a car, a pack of enormous otters, and this is a strange type of rhino, the biggest bear that has ever lived. This strange type of Ice Age kangaroo, this Ice Age squirrel.
Yeah, so they don't do that, and that's the show's big problem, and it's the one thing that everyone can agree is the show's biggest problem. Now, as revealed to us in a Reddit AMA by some of the show's crew, this decision was made due to executives fearing that the usage of scientific names would be too technical, and by proxy, scare off any general audiences. Aside from this feeling like an insult to assume that people wouldn't know what a lot of Ice Age animals are, honestly, the Ice Age might have just as much, if not more, heavy hitters than, say, the end of the Cretaceous does. But I feel like you have the inverse problem of not being specific enough and having segments and creatures blend into each other in the mind of the audience. Imagine you're talking to someone about this show, and you ask them what their favorite segment was, and they tell you that they like the one with the sloth. And you ask, great, which one? These animals all have unique set pieces dedicated to them, and lumping all these species under the label of sloth just simply does not work. If anything, it goes against the educational value that this documentary series should have. What's the point of being a documentary if every new animal you see is hardly given any real distinction from each other? But I will say, despite these points I'm making, not every species should be referred to by their scientific name. Just hear me out on this, alright? Obviously, no one is going to make the argument that many of the most famous animals here should be exclusively referred to by their scientific names. The only reasonable exception to this rule is Smilodon. That's a case where its scientific name and its common name are equally iconic. And in all fairness, they sort of do that between both of Smilodon Populator's appearances in the show, but other cases of animals with super well-known common names, like the different types of mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, bears, and hyenas, are all iconic enough to the point where a scientific name is just unnecessary. Nobody is looking at a woolly rhino and calling it Coelodonta. There's also a handful of much more recently extinct animals like stellar sea cow, giant moa, and elephant bird, where calling them by their common name just makes the most sense in that particular situation. I'll even make the case that there's some B-tier Ice Age animals that have iconic enough common names to the point where I don't really have a problem with them using that name as opposed to the scientific one, like scimitar cat instead of Homotherium, short-faced bear instead of Arctodus, or marsupial lion instead of Thylacoleo. It's just, once you get to the point where Glyptotherium and Didacurus are both referred to as armadillos, and Procoptodon and Proleopus both as kangaroos, you should absolutely use their scientific names as opposed to just giving them common names. Here's something I don't understand, right? If they want to use common names for each species, then fine, sure. But I feel like there's more that can be done with it than just giving them the most simple and bare-bones descriptions imaginable. Using the sloths for this example, what exactly was stopping them from, say, referring to each of them as Jefferson's ground sloth, giant ground sloth, and Shasta ground sloth, respectively? You know, get specific with your common names. Elasmotherium is a great example of this. Instead of just calling it a rhino, you could call it by its common name, Siberian unicorn. How awesome would it be for them just to randomly drop that out of the blue? The segment starts and you get the name drop like, the Siberian unicorn is actually a strange type of rhino, or something like that. It could also be used as a teaching moment, as the name Siberian unicorn stems from the now outdated idea that Elasmotherium had a giant singular horn on its face, as opposed to what we now think they had, which is a huge bump on their nose instead. I think honestly, if they had to refer to these animals by their common names most of the time, what you can do is simply name drop the species initially, then tell us about their relation to modern day animals, then go about using the common name throughout the rest of the segment. And if you think that's too hard, it's not. See Prehistoric Planet.
Barbarodactylus, powerful predatory pterosaurs that normally catch fish. Cicernosaurus, a type of small hadrosaur. A troodontid is one of the smaller members of the theropod group. Hexadopteryx, giant predatory pterosaurs. Tarbosaurs, Asia's version of Tyrannosaurus rex. Moternaria, a strange type of elasmosaur.
There's nothing that could have stopped the team behind this season from just doing that, but they don't. The words of the executives are just too strong, I guess. My other complaint is something that isn't talked about as much in comparison, but I feel like it's arguably more important to mention, and that's the segments themselves. Now, I also had issues with the segments back in Season 2, that they pulled back on the speculative behaviors that I was such a big fan of back in Season 1 and replaced it with much more standard dinosaur fare. Ice Age is nowhere near as speculative as both seasons, but at the same time, that's not the problem here. At this point, we're dealing with animals that went extinct a mere thousands, if not hundreds of years ago in some cases, and many of the animals in this show still have many living analogs that you can base them on. Because of that, I don't really bemoan the series for being less speculative as a result. My big complaint with the segments is something that is immediately noticeable when compared to the first two seasons. Not enough animals die in this show. One of the things that Prehistoric Planet was well known for and became somewhat of a big meme in the paleo community is how many animals, particularly how many baby animals, were killed in those first two seasons. Oh, look at the little baby. I Ice Age, on the other hand, doesn't do this. In nearly every segment, the main character animal makes it out of whatever situation they are in completely fine. No main character is allowed to die or have anything bad happen to them. If it's a family that's struggling to find food or water, they'll somehow get what they're looking for and feed their group. If it's a parent or child and they're approached by a predator, then they escape or are capable of defending themselves and driving off the predator.
Bonus points if the predator ends up dying in the process or is implied to die after the segment ends.
By episodes 3 and 4, this formula became so apparent that whenever it popped up, it had me ever so slightly rolling my eyes. I think back to the Mammoth segment in Grassland specifically. It's an extremely tough drought. The baby is about to die due to the dust storm that just rolled through, but then the rains finally come through and the baby just somehow gets back up and survives. Hooray! In reference to the baby's dying thing specifically, once again, this was a detail that was explained away in the Reddit AMA. The choice seemed to be more deliberate than the previous, and seemed to be a motif that would be used in the season to further contrast it with the previous two. That in question being the importance of parental care among mammals as opposed to the comparative lack of parental care in reptiles. This isn't stated by anyone in the AMA, but I'd imagine that this sort of mentality also extended into the general theme of protection amongst family groups. Hell, it's specified in the trailer.
Where the surest way to survive is together.
Now, I am in two minds about this. On one hand, I don't mind the theme of familial connection among mammals and birds being an ongoing motif in the season, and in some cases, it works totally fine for the show. Episode 1 is absolutely fine in this regard. Being an episode all about how animals are adapting to the Ice Age, I think it'd be counterintuitive to see animals failing to do so in this aspect. On the other hand though, there's the theme of one episode being about how family units support each other in the Ice Age, and then there's the entire season basically doing the same formula every time. Again, almost every segment follows this same formula, and as a result, it becomes predictable and a little boring. It's a formula that also applies to a lot of the non-parental unit segments in the show. Many animals manage to escape predators or overcome the odds of their situation completely fine. Thinking back to the first two seasons of the show, it wasn't afraid to have an established character lose by the segment's end, or have a parent lose their child to a predator. Hell, even the Walking With series wasn't afraid to show its main characters have tragic endings or have younger animals be killed to showcase the hardships of life. Stuff like this may be upsetting to some, but it leaves much more of an impact than just having the same outcome every single time. I think this is the reason why many people gravitate to the Gigantopithecus as their favorite segment of the season. It doesn't end on a happy note. Sure, the Gigantopithecus found himself a meal, but the segment ends on the note of him probably being the last of his kind, his calls being sent out into the world with no one to answer them. On a somewhat lighter note, this is probably why my favorite episode of the bunch is episode 2, New Lands. Since it uses the Great American Interchange as a framing device, it allows for a lot of fun, unique interaction between numerous different species, such as squirrels and Aramotherium, Glyptotherium and Columbian mammoths, and, in what is probably my favorite segment of the whole season, a total role reversal of the classic Terrabird and Smilodon dynamic, where when two chud Terrabirds end up succeeding by rage-baiting a Smilodon and stealing parts of his kill. It's great fun. It reminds me a lot of the best segments from season 2. Hell, even the one segment that does use the baby survival trope,
And also the only one that doesn't take place in the Americas.
has such a bizarre scenario, a dwarf stegodon elephant being harassed by giant storks, that it could go in whatever direction. It's almost like it's paying homage to that one Walking With Beasts line. I mentioned at the start of the negative section that these problems are both generally united by a theme of executive/corporate meddling, and while the latter of the two problems is far less affected by it, the fact is that there was a bigger corporate push to make this show more wholesome and happy, especially since this season would be dropped during Thanksgiving week in America. I think that as a result, a lot of Prehistoric Planet's unique voice has been lost because of these changes. The show's refusal to highlight new species the audience hasn't heard of before and just call them common names, and the show's insistence on each animal having a happy ending go against so much of what made Prehistoric Planet seasons 1 and 2 so great. They loved dropping new species that the public hadn't heard of, and they weren't afraid of showcasing the more violent and upsetting sides of nature when need be. They wanted to be real nature documentaries and totally succeeded in that regard. Comparatively, Prehistoric Planet Ice Age feels like there's a really good documentary on par with those seasons, and that voice does occasionally pop up in some really great segments, but the rest of the season feels so neutered in comparison, and that's a real shame. Despite this though, I can't say that this is a bad or even mid-season. Everything else that makes Prehistoric Planet is still here, and it's still firing on all cylinders. I cannot say that I had a bad time watching this show overall, and honestly, if there's a chance they'll do a season 4 where they tackle more of the Ice Age, I'm here for it. for it. Hopefully, since the criticisms for this season are so unanimous, it'll lead to a course correction in the future and allow Prehistoric Planet to truly shine once again. As it stands though, Prehistoric Planet Ice Age is a gem that's just been dug up from the ground, but there are still those amazing bright spots within. I feel comfortable giving Prehistoric Planet Ice Age a 7 out of 10, but closer to a 6 than I would an 8. But of course, these were just my thoughts, and I want to know yours. Did you agree with any of my critiques? What was your favorite episode from the batch? And what was your favorite creature? Be sure to share those thoughts and more in the comment section below, follow me on my social medias, and join my Discord server, and subscribe if you liked what you saw and want to see more. Either way, I'm Sam the Gagget fan, telling you all to have a lovely rest of your day, and also telling you that I love making egg fried rice.